flat, like the map says. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. What does that mean then?
No growth.
No growth. That's good, because now you basically have a set population based on the resources that are available. And that means you have normal birth and death, right? And our density dependent driving you back to the line. If you overshoot it, well, that's when it gets nasty, because then there's not enough to go around. What does that mean people do? They kill each other for whatever reason, right? Or they try to solve the problem then and it's too late to solve it. So this is something to think about, because you're going to be at the forefront of this. Not me, I'll be dead. Right? I might see some of it, but you're probably up for some pretty pleasant things on the planet if we don't get our act together. So it's something to really think about as you go through biology, what you learn and how you're going to apply it. Because the world's going to change pretty radically as we start to hit about 10 billion people. And that's when you're going to start to see some really massive impacts. We're already seeing it around us in terms of climate and things like that. But things are likely to get really strange very quickly. And you're going to be there sitting on it, trying to be figuring out what to do. And people are going to be coming to you to figure out what to do. And so that's a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a lot of weight to put on your shoulders. But realize it's coming, okay? You're probably the generation that's going to be the one to experience it full force. Yes? Oh, I thought you had a question. So anyway, this information I'm giving you is really critical, because it's going to influence your understanding when we start to hit these marks. So carrying capacity is really important. And remember, carrying capacity shifts. So the estimate on the planet right now is we can support about 15 to 16 billion people. There are certain people among us who think that's just kind of an arbitrary line, because we'll continue to develop better ways to increase our efficiency, and therefore we can increase the output of resources, have more people on the planet. There are other people who think because of our operations on the planet, what we do to it, we're actually decreasing the carrying capacity. That's not a running recipe for success. Population growth continues to increase, but carrying capacity continues to go down. So that means we're cascading up and carrying capacity is cascading down. That means we cross the line at a lot more velocity and a higher trajectory. Is that good? That is not good. Just think of the graphs and what they mean. All right. So as a population approaches carrying capacity, what typically happens to it?
Growth rate slows down.
Growth rate slows down. Is our growth rate slowing down as a species? Oh, it is. And that's a good thing. Okay? Luckily, it's slowing down. It's not slowing down fast enough to hit the line, but it's slowing down. And so that's actually quite a good thing in comparison to the resources that are available for us. So I gave you an equation. Yes?
Why is it slowing down?
It's slowing down because of overpopulation and less resources to go around. Certain areas of the world are developing nations. The world are not as many children. Certain areas are in decline. So what we're seeing is kind of a balancing between parts of the world where they're having lots of children and parts of the world that are having not that many. And they're having a tendency to balance out to some degree, which slows the curve. But on average, it's still positive rates of increase. Okay? So it's not straight exponential. It's starting to tip, but it's still not very far from vertical. Okay? All right. So I gave you a model to express this new idea of carrying capacity. So we used the old model. What was the exponential model again? dn over dt is a function of what? Rn. But now we need to add a term that expresses how much carrying capacity space there is left. So what is that new term? K minus n over k. So k minus n is what?
Carrying capacity minus.
It means for carrying capacity minus the population size. But what does it literally mean? How many individuals you can still add to the environment, right, the population. But if you divide it by the k, what is that? The percent of k that's still available to be occupied, whether it's 10%, 90%, etc. So when you're far below k, populations are going to grow what? Fast or slow? Faster. There's lots of resources. You have lots of reproduction. As you're near k, less resources, populations grow much slower. All right. So I gave you the model. You should be able to solve it in the sense of doing a solution for it. A solution I don't expect you to do the calculus and derivations or anything like that. Just realize that a graphical solution results in what kind of curve? A logistic growth curve, which is sigmoid in nature and smooth. Okay? I do expect you to be able to solve that for a time step or two. So you should be able to plug and play. If I was to give you an example, assuming like logistic growth, this population started out at here. There's carrying capacity of this amount, right? Over time 1 to time 2, what's the population size going to be? It's always a two-step process. First you calculate what?
Change.
The number of
People added.
new recruits, and then you add that to the original population size. If I wanted multiple time steps, I'd just do iterations of it. T1 to T2, add it to the original population, then run that number through again, take the number of recruits, add that to that population starting point, and just run down the list. That can go multiple iterations in that manner. All right, so we learned how to use it. You should be able to use it, define the terms, understand what it means. Is there a competition involved in this model?
Yes.
Absolutely. What kind? Interest-specific competition, right? Because it's dealing with resources. More resources, less competition, faster growth. Less resources, more competition, slower growth. Does it work?
Under assumption.
Better than exponential? Yes. Not perfect, though, by any stretch of the imagination, but better. So for some populations, it works quite well. What are they? Little small insect populations, crustaceans in the ocean. Lots of things it works actually quite well for. Lots of microbial populations it works great. But for lots of things it doesn't. Lots of things actually model it fairly closely, but they're not smooth. So remember, the math is perfect, right? Zoop, perfectly smooth graphic. Does nature look like that? Nature kind of oscillates all over that graph. But if I was to extrapolate through all the points, it would be smooth. But it goes up and it goes down. What's that typically due to? Lag times in what? Birth and death due to the available resources. There's always lag time. The model doesn't have those lag times in it. It's instantaneous. So that's one of the biggest problems with it. All right. So remember to assume certain things about the environment. No predator, no competitors, constant. Those things are a rarity in our world. The math assumes them, but the world isn't like that. So you have to take that into consideration. So let's talk about where it works and doesn't work. So does it work for flamingos? No, it sucks for flamingos. It's terrible. It doesn't work at all. Tell me why. Because the model assumes that every individual you add is what? Negative to the growth rate. But you add more flamingos and it's actually what? It's positive to the growth rate because of their social behaviors. Same thing with the trees in the Serengeti Plains. The other assumption is, we've been talking about, the population approaches decay smoothly. Is that the case? Most populations do not approach smoothly at all decay. They overshoot it by far. And as they overshoot, what are they forced to do? Not enough resources? Slam below it. Not there's too many resources, make a bunch of offspring, slam back up. So it has a tendency to oscillate up and down over decay, not hit it smoothly. And then the last one, again, is it assumes that the populations are large, and being large is really important for regulating your density. Is that true? It is, but there are lots of populations that are what?
Small.
That are not large, they're small. And never get large enough for competition over resources to be that important. And it fails miserably for those kinds of populations, which go straight up and straight down. They never level out. All right, we're talking about density-dependent and density-independent control. If the per capita impact, predation, competition, or virility, whatever it might be, is dependent on the numbers and the density of the population, then it's density-dependent control. So moderate levels of predation, competition, or virility, what they can do is drive populations back down to their carrying capacity or lift them up to their carrying capacity. Density-independent control means that the impact has no relationship with the density. So it doesn't matter if there's 1 million or if there's 10. The effect is always the same. So the difference is, graphically, if I was to look at it from per capita impact percent, density dependence means it goes straight up. I should say straight up. It goes up in a linear profile, so there's some increase in the effect. Or you could actually have a decrease in the effect, but there's some relationship to effect and density. For independent, what does it look like? It's perfectly flat. There's no relationship between the density and the percent impact. That's how you tell the difference. In real world, for most populations, what's in control? Both. So you have smaller scale oscillations around carrying capacity due to what? Density dependence or density independence? Density dependence. And then every once in a while you get a big overshoot or a massive drop, undershoot. What's that do? That's density independent effect is something like the weather got crazy. It was a super great year of rain. It was a terrible year of rain, and it blasted down. And then slowly density dependence will push it back again to the line. All right. So I think that brings us up to speed, yes? We gave some examples. So bubonic plague was an example of what? Density dependence. The more rats there were, the more what there was? Fleas. The more fleas there were, the more plague there was to be spread. The tighter we were packed together, the bigger the what? The death rate. Okay, so density was directly related to the mortality rate, which went up the more tightly we packed together as a species. We talked about the monarchs. It didn't matter if there was 3 of them or 3 million of them. Once you reach a certain physiological minimum of temperature, what happens? They die. All right? So that was an example of density independence. All right, what I want to talk about today is related to this, and it talks about the stability of a population. So we can have unstable or stable populations. So what's the difference? Well, a stable population is typically at a stable equilibrium point, meaning that the population size remains constant through space and time. All right? So how does that work? Well, the way to think about it is like this. I can bump it up, and there can be a little bit more, or I can bump it down, but it keeps returning to that population size over and over. Maybe I bump it up, but it comes right back down. Maybe it drops out, but it comes right back down. So graphically, you can think about it like this. I have my population density over time. I have some kind of event like good rain that bumps up the population a little bit, but then the next year's kind of pretty much the same as it normally is, and there's less go around. Some organisms die and you go back to the original population size. You have a really bad year, and so lots of organisms die, but the next years are kind of like the ones that they always are in relative moderate rainfall, and it drives it back up to that set level. Notice the points. 1, 2, 3 over there. It keeps hitting the line time and time again, right? That would be considered to be a stable equilibrium. The way to think about it, see that cone over there? You guys have all seen traffic cones, yeah? All right. So if I just go up to a traffic cone and I just barely tap it like that, it moves, yes? But what does it do? It kind of warbles a little bit, and then it settles right down to where it was before. That's an example of a stable equilibrium. I can perturb it in lots of different directions, but because of the nature of its wide base, it kind of returns right back to the same position. Now, what would be the opposite of that? Well, what drives that are density-dependent controls like moderate predation, moderate competition, moderate herbivory. Density-dependent control is an example of how you retain that. All right? The opposite of that would be an unstable equilibrium. That means if you perturb the original population size, it never returns to the initial conditions ever again. So graphically, it would look like this. I had a good rainy year, and that jumped the population up. But then it went up even further. And then I had kind of a bad year, and instead of getting back to the line, it drops way below the line. And then maybe it oscillates below the line for a while, then it maybe goes back up. Did it ever come back to the original condition that it started at? No. So that's an unstable equilibrium. Now here's the interesting thing about an unstable equilibrium. They can become stable again, but never in the same spot. So I could basically stabilize this somewhere, but it would be higher or lower. It would never be at that spot. But I can stabilize it, and it can be stable through time again. But if I perturb it, it'll be someplace else, and it'll never go back to initial conditions. That's an unstable equilibrium. The thing about kind of the analog is the cone. So instead of the traffic cone with the wide base, I just flip it over. And now I got the little thin base at the bottom. Well, if I kick that, does it ever just go zoink and right back up again? No, it lays over flat. And the only way to kind of get back is I'd have to go and try and figure out where it's at. I can't get it back to that initial spot, right? Or it can't do it on its own is the way to think about it, right? So that would be an example of an unstable equilibrium if I flip the cone the other way. What causes this? Actually, inverse density dependence can be related to this. And the flamingos are a nice example of this, right? So think about it from a mortality standpoint. The bigger the density of the prey item the flamingo was, what happened to the effects of the predator? Did they go up or did they go down? As a percent, they went down. The more birds I had, even though predators were eating tons of them, the overall mortality as the cohort as a whole went down, 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 down. And they had no impact on regulating that population. when the numbers were really high. That's an example of inverse density dependence. You can also get density dependence with very long timelines. That means I eat food right now in this resource gradient, but I don't have an offspring 2 years later. By the time the offspring's born, does the resources look anything like they were when I had them, when I actually conceived the kid? No, totally different. And so that means I have no idea if it's going to be bad or good or wet when that offspring is born. Lots of animals actually suffer from this long gestation period. One of those is the elephant. Elephants have really long gestation periods. They can pack on a lot of biomass and they can have reproductive success. But when they calve, you never know what's going to happen in the environment, and you can lose a lot of them if they happen to have a 4-year when you have all the calves being born. So that's an example of density dependence. It can really screw it up because I'll eat something now when conditions are good. I'll pack a bunch of offspring on, but they're basically coming out in the future. Conditions might totally suck. So what happens? A bunch of them die, plus a bunch of other members of the population die, and it slams it way down below the line of carrying capacity typically. So you can kind of wildly oscillate back and forth and never stabilize. All right, so that's a stable and unstable equilibrium. I want to talk about something called a metapopulation. A student asked me a while ago, I can't remember the exact question, but it was something about how migration can stabilize a population or species persistence. And so I'm going to talk about that now, how migration actually stabilizes overall populations and leads to long-term species persistence. So we've been talking about populations as kind of a homogeneous whole. But is there like a global population of organisms that's completely dispersed equally and all the resources are the same? It doesn't work that way, right? No population looks like that. So we're a nice example of this. Human beings occupy the entire planet. We're on every continent. We're even on Antarctica, right? We're even on places that aren't continents, like the North Pole, sitting on the ice and things like that, right? So we're all over the place. But are we uniformly distributed? No, not at all. I always laugh at all the political machinations. That they make me laugh, they make me cry. You know, I like to look at these political maps sometimes where they talk about kind of what the country looks like and all this stuff, all the colors. And I always laugh at that because they're completely inaccurate. You should look at population maps, and they look really different. If you look at population maps of the United States, what would the size of California be? It's like 1/3 of the United States, right? It occupies that's how many people live in California. It's so popular. So when you look at population in the United States, where's it all found? It's all the coastlines, right? That's where it's all located at. And it's not just the coastlines, but where on the coastlines? Big giant cities. So human beings are clustered into these big giant urban areas. However, they're connected, right? How are they connected? Roads, airplanes, foot traffic, whatever it might be, bicycle. So migration connects all these big centers. Now, you think about LA, it's a massive city, right? New York is a massive city. But there's lots of stuff in between where there's nothing. Nothing. A couple people per, 2 people per 100 miles or something like that, right? So, but we're connected with all of this migration, and that's going to have a big impact. So this is what I want you to think about how the world's really organized. It's not a homogeneous population where everything's equally distributed across the space. It looks like this. Certain population centers are much bigger than others. They have more individuals in them. Some are much smaller and have fewer individuals. So think of it like a big giant city like New York, or a smaller city like, what's a small city? A terrible small place you never want to go to. Reno's actually nice. I would like to go to Reno. Lose money and enjoy myself. Maybe it's not that nice, but it's actually quite big. Something a lot bigger than actually. Anybody from Baker?
Where?
You ever seen Baker, California? Yeah. Baker, California is a truck stop place on the way to like the Eastern Sierra, like Mammoth Lake or something like that. That's one of those little small places that you don't ever want to do. Okay? So there's these little tiny places like that. And other populations, not just human beings, this is the norm for how our world's set up. This is how populations are broken up in space and time. So what connects these populations then is immigration and emigration. Things come in, things go out, and that drives the dynamics. So each individual population patch is undergoing different rates of reproduction and survival based on the resources that are there, because they're different. The resources are not the same in any one place or time, right? Because K is always varying. So migration between these patches, or colonization of empty patches, is really critical for how the overall population, the entire thing as a whole, is either increasing or decreasing or remaining stable. Okay? The whole entire population can be going up, but individual patches could be doing what? Actually going down. It just depends on what the average is. So let's talk about this, because this is actually a little more complex than it seems at first glance. So migration is super important. Now here's the thing. I can have really rapid migration between the patches. Things are going in and out, going in and out really fast, okay? Now, do you think that's a good thing for species persistence through time, to have really rapid migration? What would be your guess? It actually is not. And here's the reason. So, notice it says local population fluctuations are dampened. What that means is that each of those populations are increasing or decreasing at different rates. Now you can think of them as sine waves, right? Big populations, because they have a lot of individuals and a lot of not surface area, but a lot of area in the habitat, they have a tendency to have relatively buffered growth rates or rates of decline. And they kind of go up slowly, and they go down slowly. And they go up slowly, and they go down slowly, right? So their amplitude can be pretty big, but it's usually, the frequency is pretty wide, right? The frequency is slow. Little populations, on the other hand, don't have much resistance to growth or decline. So for instance, if I lost one individual out of 1 million, is that really a big deal in terms of decline? That's a little tiny nudge down the slope. But what if I have 10 individuals and I lose one of them? Now I've had a 10% decrease in my population. That's a big jump down the slope, right? So what that means is those little populations up there are oscillating like this, real fast. Up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. The big populations are going like this. If I increase migration rapidly between those different populations again, really moving it, right? What that means is it mutes the differences in the sine waves. Rapid migration speeds up the slow big populations a little bit more, and it slows down the really fast small populations, so they link up in synchronous oscillation, and they start to go up and down at the same speed. Now, is that a good thing? It's not, and this is why. So you start out, if you're a small population, you go up and down like this, right? You grow, you decline, you grow, you decline. Big populations have more resistance to change, and they're like this. They're slow. But if I have rapid migration between them, what will happen is they'll overlap with each other to form some moderate level of frequency. And now what's the problem with that? The populations are going up and down all at the same time. What's the issue? Well, you can think about this as a dartboard. And so, superimposed on this are lots of bad environmental things. Right? Let's say this is a disease. And here's the disease, and it hits here, and it hits here. Oh, the disease hits right there at that point in time. Is that such a big deal? Can we survive that? Yeah, because the population is doing what? It's increasing and it's really high. But what if the disease hits right there? Now what happens? You could wipe out every individual in the total population. Not only that, but when you're rapidly migrating like that, if I get a disease in any one of these patches, what happens to it almost instantaneously? It spreads via migration to the entire population. Boom, you get winked out. All right? So that's why when you converge the oscillations with increase and decrease via rapid migration, it ends up badly and it ends up in extinction. So that's what that means when it says dampen. It means that you're converging the oscillations, okay? All right, let's look at the next one. All right, well that was bad. What if we get rid of or really decrease migration down to a crawl so we hardly have any migration? Do you think that's really good for species persistence through time? So what that means is we're never converging. They stay completely apart through time. So it looks like this again. But now we get rid of migration. So this one's just doing this. And this one's doing this. Is that a good thing? I won't spread the disease. It'll stop. It'll kill whatever's there and won't spread. That's probably pretty good. But what's the problem here? I'm still throwing darts all along. The environment doesn't like us. It don't care. Right? Which one has a higher, if I'm just throwing darts, which one has a higher potential to get hit at the bottom per unit time? Look how many opportunities I have to hit this one. Okay, so this one gets winked out early. Less opportunities here, but now here's the situation. If I had migration, I could wink out this, and in the next time step, I can recolonize it from here if it's alive. But if there's no migration, it's isolated and dead. Well, eventually, what's going to happen? Somewhere, I'm going to hit it. Somewhere, sooner or later, I'm going to get lucky. It may take a long time, but boom, I hit you right at the bottom and you go down. And once you go down, can you recolonize the space from anywhere else? No, because all the little ones are gone, followed by the medium ones, and all that's left are those big ones at the end will finally winked out too. So sooner or later, that leads to death as well and extinction. So that's not good. So what's left? Someplace in the middle. So intermediate levels of migration end up actually causing species to persist through time. Well, how does it work? So this was lots of migration. This is no migration. Well, what if we have something in the middle? This one's doing what again in terms of its frequency of oscillation? It's got a really fast frequency. And this one? Slow. But now I just kind of have moderate levels of migration. So it's going to do what to this frequency? Slow it up, but just a little. And it's going to do what to this? Speed it up, but just a little. So what's going to happen is they're going to overlap with each other like this. It slowed that one up, and it sped this one up. But notice, is it ever in synchrony? Never. Now I can wipe this one out with my disease hit, but what happens in the very next time step? This can recolonize into here and winks back on. Does that make sense? Because one is getting hit, but another one's doing fine. The one that's doing fine can donate individuals to the one that was doing poorly and reconstitute the population. So you can almost think about it as lights on a board, right? When I have rapid migration, all the lights are doing what? They start off flashing, some are slow and some are fast, and they start to do what? Think about them as lights that flash. The little ones are going like this. Flash on, off. But these ones are doing what? Like this. But then you'll have lots of migration, and they go off and on at the same time. And the whole board's blinking on and off. Something bad happens when they're all off, you're done, you don't come back on. No migration. The little ones are going like this, the big ones are going like that, and all of a sudden the little ones are extinct. They all disappear on the board. And then all of a sudden the medium sizes are gone, and you're left with one or two big lights going like this. And eventually what happens? They wink out too, the board is black. Right? It's gone. But then you have intermediate levels. Whoop, there went a little one. Any big deal? Nope. Right in the next time step, what happens? Something came over here, donated individually, it winks back on. One goes extinct over there, no big deal. What happens? Another time step later, it comes back on. So even though individual populations within the whole might go extinct, the overall population is doing what? Persisting through space and time. So that leads to long-term species persistence within the individual patches in the overall scenario. So that's the basic idea. This is referred to as a metapopulation, a population broken down into individual subunits. Those subunits combine connected via migration with intermediate levels responsible for long-term species persistence. All right, how do we use it? Well, since it's so common, well, we can use it in a lot of different ways. One of the simplest ways to understand this concept is to talk about, well, if I have all these individual patches of habitat, how many will be occupied per unit time based on colonization and extinction rates, right? So that's what we're going to take a look at. So I have over here some populations. Some of the habitat's filled up, some is not. And then after some change in time, I want to know how many of those sites can be potentially filled up or maybe go extinct. So I'm going to give you a model here. F is the fraction. Before I do that, let me hook this up. Why don't you guys log on with your iClickers, because I'm going to run a problem here in a minute.